And the following lessons will be covering the history of the Rebbeim of Chabad, starting with the first Rebbe of Chabad, who was called Reb Shneir Zalman. He was also known in the world by various names. He's known as the Baal HaTanya v'HaShulchan Aruch because of the fact that he wrote the Sefer Tanya and he wrote a Shulchan Aruch. He's also known by the name the Magid of Lozhna, which is a city that he lived in originally, the city of Lozhna. He's also known as the Rav of Ladi. Ladi is the name of the city where he lived at a later point. However, within Lubavitch itself, within Chabad itself, he is called the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe was born on the day of Chai Elul, the 18th of Elul, in the year Tov Kuf Hei, which is 1745, in a small city near the city of Lozhna. The Alter Rebbe's parents were a Baruch, was his father, and his mother was the Rebbetzin Rivka. The Frierdiker Rebbe, in the Sichos, talks about the birth of the Alter Rebbe and said the following: every neshama, before it comes down to this world to enter a body, has to prepare itself. And the amount of time that the neshama needs to prepare itself is a year. An entire year the neshama spends getting ready to come down to this world and enter a body. However, when a new neshama comes down, a neshama chadasha, this neshama has to prepare itself 3 years. In other words, a neshama that was never here in this world before, and this is going to be its first time to enter a body, that neshama, which is of a much higher spiritual capacity, that neshama needs 3 years of preparation. So 3 years before the birth of the Alter Rebbe, who had a neshama chadasha, the Baal Shem Tov already knew that there's a new neshama that's designated to come down to this world, but he did not know who will have that new neshama, where the neshama is, and he did not know in which body it will enter, who will be the appearance of this neshama. The reason for this is because when a new neshama chadasha, comes down to this world, it's concealed from everyone, even from the angels. And the reason is because by concealing it, this is protecting the neshama that it shouldn't be hurt. The Baal Shem Tov knew what it means and what is involved when a neshama comes down to this world. He knew how it comes down. He knew all the details. But what goes on when the new neshama comes down to this world, this the Baal Shem Tov was very eager to know how this takes place. Then came the point where the Baal Shem Tov knew that this year the neshama chadasha is coming down to this world, but he still didn't know where and to which parents he will be born. At that time, Reb Baruch was one of the followers of the Baal Shem Tov. He was one of the hidden tzaddikim. There was a period where the Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov, who were hidden tzaddikim, were instructed by the Baal Shem Tov that they should be hidden from one another. In other words, one hidden tzaddik didn't even know who the other hidden tzaddik was. And then there was a time where the Baal Shem Tov said they were allowed to identify themselves to each other, but he cautioned them that they shouldn't identify themselves, they shouldn't expose themselves to other people outside of that circle. Reb Baruch was one of the people that nobody knew that he was a student of the Baal Shem Tov, except for his wife, the Rebbetzin Rivka. Reb Baruch was a descendant, he came from a very distinguished family, he was a descendant of the Maharal of Prague, and the Maharal of Prague himself, besides being the great Torah giant that he was a direct descendant of the house of Beis David, of Malchus Beis David. In fact, this is where we know that the Rabbeim of Chabad were descendants of Malchus Beis David, because all the Rabbeim are descendants of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe's father, Rebbe Baruch, was a direct descendant of the Maharam of Prague, and the Maharam of Prague was a direct descendant of Malchus Beis David. Rebbe Baruch and his wife, Rebbe Rivka, got married on a Friday. It was the 17th of Elul in the year 1743. When an entire year passed and they were not blessed with a child, Rebbe Baruch and his wife traveled to the Baal Shem Tov to request his bracha to have a child. And this was in the month of Elul, a year after they were married. The Baal Shem Tov gave them the bracha, and not only gave them the bracha, but he actually promised them that in the following year they will have a son. On the day of Chai Elul, the 18th of Elul, it was a custom that the Baal Shem Tov always made a Suda, a special meal, to celebrate his birthday, which was on Chai Elul. So on that day of Chai Elul, when Rebbe Baruch and his wife were there, the Baal Shem Tov said to Rebbe Baruch, L'moyed hazeh mamish atem chayfkim ben, which means exactly on this day you will have a son. Which means the Baal Shem Tov not only gave them a bracha, but he promised them that they're going to have a child. He told them the child would be a son, not a daughter. And he also told them the exact day that the child will be born, on Chai Elul. And naturally, this brought great joy to Rebbe Baruch and his wife, the Rebbe Rivka. However, even the Baal Shem Tov himself was not aware that there is any connection between this new neshama that's supposed to come down and this very child that he just gave a bracha to Rebbe Baruch that he should have. A few days later, on Rosh Hashanah, the Talmidim, the students of the Baal Shem Tov, noticed that the Baal Shem Tov was acting in a way which was different than he does every year. They already knew the way the Baal Shem Tov conducts himself each Yom Tov. Baal Shem Tov had a very specific way, the way he did things on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Simchas Torah, Chanukah, Purim, Pesach. And during this time of the year, starting from the month of Elul, and all the 40 days until Yom Kippur, was a time where when you saw the Baal Shem Tov and you saw the way he served Hashem, you could see that everything was in the kav of yira. He was full of awe. And he was in a very serious frame of mind. From Yom Kippur, once Yom Kippur was over, until Simchas Torah, that's when they saw the Baal Shem Tov in an intense simcha. But this year, this was a few days after Rebbe Baruch got his bracha, they saw that the Baal Shem Tov, on the night of Rosh Hashanah, acted in a different way. He was full of simcha, totally different than he is every year on Rosh Hashanah. And they felt the simcha, they felt the joy in everything that he did. They felt it in the bracha, when he gave them the bracha, L'shana tova tekoseva v'sichosemu. They felt it, the intense simcha. They felt it in the words of Torah that he gave over. They felt it by the meal. They felt it when they blew shofar, in the davening and everything that he did. And this continued all the way through the 10 days, Yom Kippur, until after Simchas Torah, the Baal Shem Tov was in a very intense simcha. The Talmidim of Baal Shem Tov realized that something unusual was going on, and they made many attempts to verify what it is that brought out this great joy by the Baal Shem Tov, but they were unsuccessful to actually find out why the Baal Shem Tov is in such great simcha. Before Rebbe Baruch and his wife Rivka left the Baal Shem Tov to go back home, they naturally went into the Rebbe, to the Baal Shem Tov, to get a bracha. The Rebbe and Rivka was in very uplifted spirits, and she said to the Baal Shem Tov that when the Eibishter will help, and this bracha will be fulfilled, and this boy will be born, I will designate him and dedicate him to studying Torah and serving Hashem in the path of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov saw how they're in such uplifted spirits, and again he gave them a bracha, and they went home. Rebbe Rivka was also an unusual woman in the sense that she was a Torah scholar. In those days, women did not have the knowledge of Torah as men, but Rebbe Rivka was unusual. She studied Torah, and she was actually a Torah scholar. Nobody knew about this except for her husband, Reb Baruch. So when she came home, she traveled to her sister-in-law, also a Rebbitzin, who lived in the city of Vitebsk, and she told her what the Baal Shem Tov said to her and her husband, and she asked her to instruct her what she should be learning during this time period, and being that she was confident that the bracha of the Baal Shem Tov will soon be fulfilled, what should she be learning during the time of her pregnancy? The fortunate day finally came when Rebbetzin Rivka was able to inform her husband that the bracha of the Baal Shem Tov is fulfilled and she's expecting a child. Even though they were sure, they were certain that the Baal Shem Tov knew that his bracha was fulfilled, because the Baal Shem Tov was a tzaddik that had the Ruach HaKodesh and prophetic vision, and there's no doubt in their mind that he knew everything. Nevertheless, Reb Baruch and his wife decided that the proper thing to do is to notify the Baal Shem Tov personally. We actually find the source for this in the Chumash. In Chumash Shmos, Parshas Yisrei, Kapitel Yutes, Pasuk Ches, it talks about how the Eibishter told Moshe Rabbeinu that he should go to the Bnei Yisrael and talk to them about receiving the Torah. And Moshe Rabbeinu went to them, and they answered, Kol asher diber Hashem nasa. Whatever Hashem spoke, that's what we will do. Then the pasuk says, Vayoshev Moshe as divrei ha'om el Hashem. Moshe went back to Hashem to report what the Yidden told him. So Rashi says, did he have to report to Hashem? Doesn't Hashem know what the Yidden answered? But this teaches us the proper way to do things. That being that the Eibishter sent me to do this, I should report back to the one that sent me and tell him. And that's what we find also with Chassidim, that there was a big emphasis on reporting to the Rebbe on all the activities that we do, and the Rebbe himself wrote many letters and spoke about this, that we should write a duch and report everything that we do, although we're certain that the Rebbe knows what we've done and what we didn't do. Nevertheless, from here we learn that the proper thing to do is to personally report, for whatever reason, to the Rebbe what we've done. So here Reb Baruch traveled to the Baal Shem Tov to report personally. He came to the Baal Shem Tov, this was in the month of Adar, and he told the Baal Shem Tov that the bracha of the Baal Shem Tov was fulfilled, and the Baal Shem Tov was very excited to hear this, and he told Reb Baruch that he should actually make the bracha Shehechiyanu, without pronouncing Hashem's name, but to make the bracha Shehechiyanu. He should go back home immediately, give over in his name to the Rebbitzin the bracha of Mazel Tov, and then he cautioned them with a number of things. And all this was quite unusual. Baruch went back home very excited. On the day of Chai Elul, the 18th of Elul, as we said before, Tov Kuf Hei, 1745, it was on a Wednesday, that was the day the Alter Rebbe was born. And they named the Alter Rebbe Shnei Zalman. At the same time that the Alter Rebbe was born in this city near Lozhne, in the city of Mezhebush, where the Baal Shem Tov was, there was a lot going on. Naturally, there were no telephones and no way of communication as we have today, but the Baal Shem Tov, with his Ruach HaKodesh, knew the Alter Rebbe was born, and on that day he celebrated in the city of Mezhebush, although nobody knew why there is a celebration. Baal Shem Tov went to the mikveh. When he came back from the mikveh, his Talmidim saw that he was in an exceptional, uplifted spirit, and he was very besimcha. Nobody was able to ask him, what is this all about? Then the Baal Shem Tov said he would daven himself for the Amud, and leading the davening, which was totally unusual. And when he did lead the davening, he sang a lot of nigunim, happy nigunim. He didn't say tachlan that day, meaning that it was some sort of a yontif. So the Chassidim knew that there's a yontif today, there's a tremendous simcha today, but they didn't know what it was. After the davening, the Baal Shem Tov asked all the students to sit down to a meal. And again, the Baal Shem Tov was in a tremendous simcha. The meal was customary because it was the Baal Shem Tov's birthday. And the Baal Shem Tov always had a meal on his birthday. But at the meal, he revealed what was going on. And he said, in Chumash it says, B'yoyim haravi nitlu hama'eris, which means on Wednesday, in the fourth day of creation, the luminaries were put up in Shamayim, the sun and the moon, which are the two things that give light to the world. So the Baal Shem Tov said, on this Wednesday of this week, the week of Kumi Oiri, these are the words that we find in the Haftarah of that week. Kumi Oiri, stand up, my light. A new neshama chadasha, came down to this world. And this new neshama is going to bring light to the world in the revealed part of Torah and in the part of Torah of Chassidus. And this new neshama will have Mesiras Nefesh for the path of Chassidus, but she will succeed until Mashiach will come. And in that Suda, the Baal Shem Tov also spoke about the pasuk Zei Nachamenu, which is very interesting that the Baal Shem Tov spoke about the pasuk Zei Nachamenu, even though the simple interpretation of that would be Zei Nachamenu means this one will console us. The Alter Rebbe will bring consolation to the world with the new teachings of Chassidus. But perhaps there's another meaning to this. The Alter Rebbe was the first Rebbe of Chabad. The Alter Rebbe is the one that's going to bring in a new light into the world through the teachings of Chabad. But the Rebbe that will complete it and complete the teachings of Chabad and bring Mashiach and bring the Geula as Melech HaMashiach, that's the seventh Rebbe of Chabad. And that is hinted in the word Zei Nachamenu. We find various stories where the Alter Rebbe himself, when he spoke about the Tzemach Tzedek, whose name was Menachem, he connected it to the word Zei Nachamenu. So perhaps when the Baal Shem Tov spoke at this Suda, celebrating the birth of the Alter Rebbe, who's going to be the first one to open the gates of this new path of Chassidus, he also spoke about Zei Nachamenu, which talks about the Rebbe, which is the seventh Rebbe of Chabad, to complete the whole Aveda of Chassidus Chabad. This was on the day of Chayel. On that Shabbos, the Alter Rebbe again spoke Torah on the same words of Kumi Oiri, and on the 25th of Elul, which was actually the day of the Alter Rebbe's bris, but nobody realized it, that was the Genda Baal Shem Tov made a Suda, and he spoke words of Torah on the pasuk by Yom Hashmini Yimel B'Sar Losei. So he spoke about bris milah and about circumcision. And on Shabbos, the following Shabbos after the bris, he again spoke about the words of the Haftarah Seis Osis B'Havaya, which talks about Simcha. Later, when the Alter Rebbe came to be a student of the Maggid Mizrich, the Maggid's son, which was Rabbi Avraham the Malach, he used to teach the Alter Rebbe. He told him that he heard from his father, the Maggid, and the Maggid said that he heard this from the Baal Shem Tov directly. He told him the story of how on the day of Chai Elul, when the Alter Rebbe was born, he was in a great simcha, and he had his meal, and everything we just mentioned, the Maggid Mizrich told these stories to the Alter Rebbe. And he said that he heard it from the Baal Shem Tov himself. And the Baal Shem Tov said to the Maggid wasn't there at the time that it happened, because that year, Tov Kuf Hey, the Maggid wasn't yet a student of the Baal Shem Tov. So he didn't see this personally. But the Baal Shem Tov told him that all this happened. And the Baal Shem Tov added that the reason why I'm telling you all this, of what happened, is because the Alter Rebbe is yours, meaning he's designated to be your student. So therefore, you should know all the things that are connected to him. On Yom Kippur, there's the Yom Kippur after the Alter Rebbe was born, Reb Baruch came to the Baal Shem Tov to give over the good news that the baby was born. when he came into the Baal Shem Tov told him that he shouldn't tell anyone that a child was born, and he shouldn't tell anyone the name that he gave the child. When Rebbe Baruch was ready to go back home, the Baal Shem Tov gave him special instructions how he should conduct himself with this child. And he cautioned him that he should always be careful and always watch over him. And in summertime, he should be out with him in the fields. The Baal Shem Tov cautioned him that he should keep him away from the eyes of people, and especially from women. Women usually talk about little children, about the wise things that they do, to try to prevent that the Alter Rebbe should not be seen and people shouldn't talk about him. The Baal Shem Tov used to mention the Alter Rebbe's name, Shnei Zalman, 3 times a day, every time that he davened. The following year, when the Alter Rebbe was a little bit over a year old, Rebbe Baruch came again to the Baal Shem Tov for Rosh Hashanah, and the Baal Shem Tov asked him all the details about the Alter Rebbe's behavior and how they're dealing with the Alter Rebbe, and again he cautioned him not to tell anyone about this child. After Sichos, when Rebbe Baruch was ready to go back home, the Baal Shem Tov once again gave him detailed instructions how he should act with the Alter Rebbe for the entire year, and he cautioned him again that people shouldn't see him and they shouldn't talk about his wisdom as parents usually do. The following year, when the Alter Rebbe was a little bit over 2 years old, again Rebbe Baruch came to the Baal Shem Tov for Rosh Hashanah, and again the Baal Shem Tov asked him in full detail everything about the Alter Rebbe, and Rebbe Baruch told the Baal Shem Tov how the Alter Rebbe, they realize now, has an incredible, phenomenal memory, and whatever he hears once, he never forgets. The Baal Shem Tov cautioned them again that they should not even tell people that they have a child, and when people ask about children, they should just say, they hope to Hashem everything will be b'hatzlacha. Before Rebbe Baruch left home, he told the Baal Shem Tov that he and the Rebbe and Rivka made a decision that for the 3rd birthday, when it comes time to cut the Alter Rebbe's hair, they'd like to bring the Alter Rebbe to the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov agreed, but again he cautioned him that they should watch the child very carefully, and that the ones who should bring him to the Baal Shem Tov to cut his hair should be the Rebbetzin Rivka and her sister-in-law, the Rebbetzin Dver. He told them that they should come on the day of Chai Elul, which is the birthday, and after the davening, he will cut the Alter Rebbe's hair, and they should go right back. But he cautioned them that nobody should know about this. Naturally, from all this cautioning, it became very clear to them that there's something very special, very unusual about the Alter Rebbe, and therefore he has to be protected and hidden, and therefore there's so much cautioning around the Alter Rebbe. A year later, when the Alter Rebbe was 3 years old, they did as they were instructed. The Rebbetzin Rivka and her sister-in-law, Rebbetzin Dver, came to Mezhebush to the Baal Shem Tov, and he cut the hair of the Alter Rebbe and told him to go right back. And they did not tell the Alter Rebbe that this is the Baal Shem Tov. But every time that the Alter Rebbe would ask, who is this person who's cutting my hair, Rebbetzin Rivka would answer, this is the Zayda. In fact, we find that later, when the Alter Rebbe became a Rebbe, when he referred to the Baal Shem Tov, he used to refer to him as Zayda. And he explained that he's a Zayda in a spiritual sense, because he's his Rebbe's Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe's Rebbe was the Mezritcher Maggid. The Mezritcher Maggid's Rebbe was the Baal Shem Tov. So in essence, in a spiritual sense, he's his Zayda. And on that day, when the Alter Rebbe had his haircut, the Baal Shem Tov made a Suda, it was Chai Elul, and he said that this person who has the Neshama, this new Neshama in Poland, nobody knew who it was, today he became 3 years old. And when Avraham Avinu became 3 years old, that's when he recognized Hashem. And this child also will have to go through tremendous Mesiras Nefesh, like Avraham Avinu, in order to bring out into the world new a derech, a new path in serving Hashem and bringing out the oneness of Hashem and teaching the world about Hashgacha Pratis. And the Baal Shem Tov said that the Alter Rebbe's neshama is a great neshama, and he's called Shneir because Shneir means Shnei two lights. He will light up the world in the Nigla, in the revealed part of Torah, and will light up the world in Nister, in the hidden part of Torah. When the Alter Rebbe became 5 years old, the Alter Rebbe later told his Einikol, his grandchild, the Tzemach Tzedek, that at that age of 5 he felt that the gates of Torah were totally open to him. And the most difficult subject of Torah he was able to understand and grasp in all its details very easily. In fact, if anything, it bothered him, it pained him, that he didn't have the opportunity to work hard in Torah study. As you know, there's a tremendous advantage in not just learning Torah, but Yegiya, which means to really make an effort and to exert yourself and to labor away when it comes to Torah study. And the Alter Rebbe felt, because everything was so simple to him, because of his mind was open, he didn't have the opportunity to work hard. When the Alter Rebbe became 8 years old, he wrote a Pirush on Torah. It was a Pirush, a commentary that included in it the Pirush of Rashi, Even Ezra, and Ramban. In other words, everything that they say, Rashi, Even Ezra, and Ramban, say in their commentary was all included in what the Alter Rebbe wrote. And he was only 8 years old. 2 years later, when the Alter Rebbe was 10 years old, he had a very unusual dream. He dreamt that he was sitting in the shul, in a side room, in the city of Lozhin, and he was learning. Suddenly, Reb Reuven Baal Shem walks into the shul, and he says to the Alter Rebbe, "You're being called to a din Torah, and you must walk into the shul." The Alter Rebbe walks into the shul, and he sees a bezdin sitting there, and near the place where the bezdin is sitting, there's another table, and there are 3 older people sitting by that table. The bezdin, with 3 rabbis wrapped in their talesim, and one of them said to the Alter Rebbe, "These 3 older people that you see are Rashi, the Even Ezra, and the Ramban, and they are the ones that are calling you to Din Torah. And the reason is because you wrote a commentary that includes everything that they write, which means people will stop learning what they write and they'll start learning what you wrote. And therefore you're taking away from them the Sichos that so many people will be learning their Pirush." The Alter Rebbe said he had no words to defend himself, and in a crying voice he said, "If that's the case, I'll burn what I wrote." And the 3 older people put their hands on the Alter Rebbe's head, and they gave him a bracha that he should succeed in his studies, and he should be able to be mechadish chidush Torah, should find new insight in Torah and in serving Hashem, and that thousands and tens of thousands of Yidden in all the generations to come should follow his path until Mashiach comes. When the Alter Rebbe woke up, he was very concerned about this dream, to the extent that he decided to fast. But then he had the dream a second time, and then he had the same dream a third time. At that point, he took what he wrote and he actually burned it.